The clock struck 8 as I, Eleanor, sat at the dining table, sipping my tea in silence. At 55, I prided myself on maintaining a sense of style and grace. My job as a senior editor at a lifestyle magazine wasn't just a career, it was my passion, a part of who I was. Richard, my husband of nearly 30 years, sat across from me, his eyes glued to his phone. The silence between us wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, loaded with years of unspoken resentments and faded love. "I wish you'd just die already," Richard muttered, not looking up from his screen. His words sliced through the quiet room like a sharp knife. I felt a chill run down my spine, not from fear, but from the sheer coldness of his statement. "What did you just say?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Richard finally looked up, his expression one of annoyance rather than regret. "You heard me. It's not like you're doing anything valuable, just taking up space." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was the man I had married, the man who had once promised to cherish me. Now he wished me dead. Our marriage had become a shadow of what it once was. Richard's outdated beliefs, his insistence that a woman's place was in the home, clashed fiercely with my independence and career ambitions. It wasn't just about us anymore. His mother, Claire, a widowed woman of considerable wealth, had become a point of contention. Richard often spoke of her fortune, eyeing it like a vulture. "You're unbelievable," I said, my voice tinged with disgust. "Is this really what our marriage has come to? You wishing me dead?" Richard scoffed. "Marriage? This is a contract of convenience, nothing more. And let's not pretend you're not waiting for Claire to kick the bucket for her money." His accusation was like a slap in the face. Unlike him, I had never seen Claire as a walking bank account. She was a kind, intelligent woman who deserved better than a son waiting for her demise. "You're a monster," I said quietly, standing up from the table. "I don't even know who you are anymore." Richard's laugh was cruel and hollow. "Oh, Eleanor, you never knew me. You were too busy with your precious career." I walked away from the table from Richard, feeling a mixture of anger, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of loss. Not for what we had, but for what we could have had, if only Richard had been the man I thought he was. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of Richard's words pressed down on me. This wasn't just a loveless marriage. It was a battlefield, and I was tired of being the only one fighting for peace. It was time to make a decision, one that would change the course of my life. The first rays of dawn brought a new resolve. I would no longer be a passive participant in this farce of a marriage. Richard had shown his true colors, and it was time for me to show mine. The following weeks were a blur of silent meals and cold stares. Richard's cruelty had unveiled a truth I had long tried to ignore. Our marriage was nothing but a hollow shell. Each evening, Richard would retreat into his world, often whispering into his phone or laughing at texts. The secrecy of his actions raised a red flag in my mind. Was he having an affair? Strangely, the thought didn't hurt as much as I expected. Perhaps it was because my own feelings for him had withered into nothingness. One night, as I lay awake, I heard Richard's muffled voice from the living room. Curiosity overtook me, and I tiptoed to the door, pressing my ear against it. "That old witch, she's just hoarding her wealth," he sneered. "Once she's gone, we'll be set for life." His words were like poison, seeping into my heart. He wasn't just betraying me. He was betraying his own mother. Claire, who had always been kind to us, didn't deserve such a fate. My heart ached for Claire. She was a strong woman, but the thought of her own son wishing her dead was too much to bear. I decided then that I needed to protect her, not just from Richard, but also from the cruel grip of greed. The next day I visited Claire. Her home was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the coldness of my own. We sipped tea, and I watched her, the lines on her face telling stories of a life well lived. "Claire, you know you can always count on me, right?" I said, reaching across the table to hold her hand. "If you ever need anything, I'm here." Claire smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I know, Eleanor, you've always been more of a daughter to me than a daughter-in-law." Her words warmed my heart, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered. I knew I had to act, to somehow shield her from the greed and malice that had consumed Richard. That evening, as I lay in bed, I realized the extent of my isolation. My marriage was a facade, and the man I shared my home with was a stranger driven by selfishness. But amidst the darkness, a plan began to form in my mind, a plan to expose Richard's true intentions and protect Claire from his clutches. I would need to be careful, cunning even. It was time for the hunted to become the hunter. With each passing day, my resolve strengthened. Richard had underestimated me, and that was his biggest mistake. The stage was set for a reckoning, and I was ready to play my part. The days turned into weeks, each one passing with the heavy knowledge of Richard's betrayal. It was during one of these monotonous days that fate took a sharp, unexpected turn. I had just returned from work when I received a phone call that would change everything. The voice on the other end was Dr. Harper, Richard's physician. "Mrs. Williams, it's about your husband," Dr. Harper said, his tone grave. "We've found something concerning in his latest tests. It's serious, and we need to discuss it with you." A cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. What could be so serious that the doctor needed to talk to me first? I met with Dr. Harper the next day. The hospital's sterile walls and the antiseptic smell did nothing to calm my nerves. Dr. Harper's words were a shockwave that shook me to my core. "Your husband has a terminal condition," he said. "I'm sorry, but he has only about 6 months left." The news hit me like a physical blow. Despite everything, Richard was still my husband, the man I had once loved. The thought of him facing death alone was unexpectedly heartbreaking. But then a twisted idea crept into my mind. What if Richard never knew about his diagnosis? The thought was vindictive, petty even, but the seed was planted. I returned home, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Richard was his usual self, dismissive and absorbed in his phone. The irony of the situation was not lost on me. Here he was, wishing death upon others, unaware of his own impending doom. "Honey, we need to talk," I said, my voice steady. Richard barely glanced up. "What now, Eleanor? Can't you see I'm busy?" His indifference fueled my resolve. "It's important," I insisted. With a heavy sigh, he put down his phone. "Fine, what is it?" I took a deep breath. "The doctor called. He said you have 6 months to live." For a moment, Richard just stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief. Then a cruel smile twisted his lips. "6 months, huh?" he said, his voice laced with mockery. "Well, isn't that a twist of fate?" His reaction was devoid of fear or sadness. Instead, there was a perverse acceptance, as if he saw it as an opportunity to live without consequences. The following weeks were surreal. Richard began living as if each day was his last, squandering money on lavish items and extravagant nights out. He was like a man possessed, desperate to squeeze a lifetime into 6 months. And through it all, I played the part of the concerned wife, all the while keeping the dark secret that it was he, not I, who was living on borrowed time. As I watched Richard spiral into a reckless abandon, a part of me felt vindicated. This was his karma, a fitting end for a man who had shown nothing but selfishness and cruelty. But another part of me, a part I wasn't proud of, couldn't help but feel a twisted satisfaction in watching him unknowingly live out his last days in a delusion of immortality. It was a cruel game, one that I never imagined I'd play. But in this twisted tale of revenge, I was no longer just a victim. I was the architect of his downfall. As Richard's self-destruction escalated, a new character entered the stage of our twisted drama. It was a chilly evening in late autumn when she appeared at our doorstep, unannounced and unexpected. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with an air of confidence that belied her years. Her name was Annabelle. "May I help you?" I asked, eyeing her cautiously. "Mrs. Williams, I'm Annabelle. I think we need to talk about Richard," she said, her voice steady and composed. The pieces fell into place with a sinking feeling in my stomach. This was the woman Richard was having an affair with. The audacity of her showing up at my house was infuriating, yet I was intrigued by what she had to say. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "Let's hear what you have to say." We sat in the living room, an awkward tension hanging in the air. Annabelle was the first to break the silence. "I know about Richard's condition," she began, "and I think it would be best for everyone if you two separated. Richard deserves to spend his last months happy." The suggestion was outrageous. Not only was Annabelle asking me to step aside for her affair, but she also believed the lie that Richard was the one dying. "And why would I do that?" I asked, my voice laced with disdain. "Because it's what Richard wants," she replied, her tone almost pleading. "He's suffering, and staying in this marriage is only making it worse." Her words were like a slap in the face. This woman, this intruder, had the audacity to speak of suffering while she played a part in destroying my marriage. You speak of suffering, I said, my voice rising. But what do you know of the years of neglect, the emotional abuse, the utter loneliness of a loveless marriage? Annabelle's confidence seemed to waver, but she held her ground. I love him, and I know he loves me too. We plan to be together once it's over. The situation was absurd. Here I was, speaking to my husband's mistress about his fictional terminal illness, a lie that had spiraled out of control. Annabelle, you're living in a fantasy, I said coldly. Richard isn't the man you think he is, and this affair, it's just a game to him. She shook her head, a look of disbelief on her face. No, you're wrong. We have something real. I wanted to laugh, to shout, to tell her the truth about everything. But I held back, a part of me wanting to see how this farce would play out. Believe what you will, I said, standing up. But know this, Richard is not a man capable of love. He's a user, a manipulator, and sooner or later you'll see him for what he truly is. Annabelle stood up, her eyes betraying a hint of doubt. I guess we'll see, she said before turning and walking out. As the door closed behind her, I was left with a sense of emptiness. This game of deception and revenge was taking a toll on me. I was caught in a web of my own making, and with each passing day the lines between right and wrong blurred a little more. But there was no turning back now. The stage was set, the players in place. All that was left was to see this twisted drama to its bitter end. The days following Annabelle's visit were a twisted dance of deception and revelation. Richard's extravagant lifestyle reached new heights, and his nights out became more frequent. It was as if he was trying to outrun the clock, to squeeze every last drop of life from his remaining days. 6 months since the doctor's call, the day of reckoning finally arrived. Richard came home late, as had become his norm, reeking of alcohol and arrogance. I sat in the living room, the lights dimmed, waiting for him. Well, look at you, playing the waiting wife, Richard sneered as he stumbled in. What's the occasion, counting down the days to my demise? His words, meant to wound, barely scratched the surface of my resolve. I had grown immune to his barbs. Actually, yes, I replied calmly. It's been 6 months, Richard. Aren't you curious about how much time you have left? Richard laughed, a hollow sound filled with denial. I feel fine, Eleanor. Better than ever, in fact. Death can wait. The irony of his statement was almost amusing. He was so engrossed in his lie that he had lost touch with reality. But there's something you should know, I continued, my voice steady. It wasn't me who received that diagnosis 6 months ago. It was you. For a moment, there was silence. Richard's face, previously flushed with drunken confidence, paled. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The terminal illness, Richard. It's yours, I said, the words feeling heavy in the air. Richard's laughter was manic, tinged with hysteria. You're lying. This is just some sick game you're playing. But as the reality of my words began to sink in, his facade crumbled. The man who stood before me was no longer the arrogant Richard I had known. He was scared, lost, a shadow of his former self. You knew, all this time you knew? He stammered, his voice breaking. I did, I admitted, and I watched as you squandered your days, thinking they were mine. The room was filled with a tense silence, the weight of years of lies and deception hanging heavy between us. In that moment, I saw Richard for what he was, a man consumed by his own selfish desires, now faced with the consequences of his actions. The next morning, Richard was gone. He had left without a word, leaving behind only the echo of his broken pride. I stood in the empty house, a sense of relief washing over me. The game was over. The lies were unraveled. In his quest for a life free of responsibility, Richard had lost everything. As I stood there, I realized that this was not a victory. There was no joy in watching a man fall from grace, even one as undeserving as Richard. What I felt was a profound sense of freedom, the chains of a loveless marriage finally broken. The drama, the revenge, it was all over. I was free to start anew, to find peace in a life unburdened by the weight of Richard's deceit. It was a fresh start, a chance to rediscover the person I had lost in the shadow of a failing marriage. And as I looked out the window at the rising sun, I knew that this was just the beginning. A new chapter in my life was waiting to be written, and for the first time in a long time I was ready to embrace it. In the weeks that followed Richard's departure, a profound sense of tranquility settled over the house. It was as if his absence had lifted a heavy veil, allowing light and air to fill spaces darkened by years of resentment and pain. I spent my days reacquainting myself with the simple pleasures of life, reading books I had long neglected, tending to the garden that had once been my sanctuary, and reconnecting with old friends. One afternoon, Claire visited me. She looked frail, but her eyes still sparkled with the same sharp intelligence and warmth. We sat in the garden, surrounded by blooming flowers and the gentle hum of life. "Eleanor, I heard about Richard," Claire began, her voice tinged with sadness. "I'm sorry it had to end this way." I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "It's all right, Claire, it was long overdue. We were both prisoners in that marriage. Now we're free." Claire nodded, a small smile gracing her lips. "You were always the daughter I never had, Eleanor. Richard's choices are his own. You shouldn't have to pay for his mistakes." Her words were a balm to my soul. In all the years of my tumultuous marriage, Claire had been a constant source of support and understanding. "Claire, I want to thank you," I said, my voice heavy with emotion, "for everything. You've been more of a family to me than anyone else." As we sat there, basking in the serenity of the garden, I realized how much of my life I had spent under Richard's shadow. But no more. I was my own person, with dreams and desires that extended beyond the confines of a loveless marriage. The next chapter of my life was just beginning, and I was determined to make it count. I would travel, write that book I always talked about, maybe even fall in love again. The possibilities were endless, and for the first time in a long time, I was excited about the future. As for Richard, I heard he had left town, chasing after some illusory freedom that would always be just out of reach. I felt no malice towards him, only a distant pity for a man who could never find contentment in what he had. Life, I had learned, was too short for regrets and bitterness. It was a gift to be cherished, a canvas to be painted with bold, bright colors. As Claire and I laughed and reminisced, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The drama, the pain, the revenge, it was all behind me. Ahead lay a path of my own making, a journey towards self-discovery and happiness. And as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the garden, I knew that this was just the beginning. A new chapter, a new life, a new Eleanor.